All right, before we get into the chat or any other comments, let's do a quick BioBot update, and then we will get into the chat. So BioBot, Comrade BioBot, is our COVID wastewater tracking friend. Now, there are some states that are, somebody just told me, I think it was like Nebraska, is ceasing their COVID-19 wastewater monitoring. I have not confirmed that, but somebody did say that to me. Anyway, this is the best way, in my book, of keeping an eye on what's actually going on with the pandemic, because they don't really count cases anymore. The cases that get counted are PCR tests, but the rapid tests, unless you go self-report, which almost nobody does, they're not getting counted. So on this graph, which you can find at biobot.io, biobot.io/data, or there's also a link that you can get to the /data part off of the front page. The blue line is the COVID-19 viral particles in the wastewater. This is a quick responding, so it's a leading, not a lagging indicator. And it's pretty accurate in that nobody has to test, they just monitor the wastewater and you get what you get. Somebody gets infected, there are things that don't get reflected in the wastewater, but like if it's not going into whatever, sewer shed is being actually monitored. People could have like a private system or something like that. But overall, this is a pretty good survey of what's going on in an area. And like I said, it's leading rather than lagging. Hospitalizations and deaths are lagging. And of course, cases is more the teal kind of seafoam green color. And you can see they stopped counting those in 2022. Well, it's also that the PCR tests stopped being covered by a lot of insurance, or, rather the government stopped paying for them and stuff like that. And so if you want a PCR test, you have to pay like $125, something like that, in a lot of cases. So hence, cases aren't being tracked. If they were, we would see a lot more cases because the wastewater is still massively high and climbing. So if we zoom in on the last 6 months there, you can see that the wastewater, I'll be bringing that up, but while we still have the overall, this is the since 2020 graph right here. The current level is as high as it was back in March. It's as high as it was last November. Like it's really high right now and climbing. So let's zoom in. This is the last 6 months. So it's the highest it's been in 6 months, back to like almost February levels, and rapidly climbing at like a 45-degree angle. Let's go into the regional view. So you can see all 4 regions. The Midwest is looking like it's declining right now. However, note that the most recent data are subject to change. This was just updated on the 17th, so 2 days ago, from samples collected during this past week. But sometimes the most recent data are incomplete and then they get fully adjusted. So sometimes there's a leveling off in the most recent data, which is just due to incomplete data. The full numbers aren't in yet. But even with what we have here, the Midwest is looking like it's dipping a little. All 3 other regions, again, climbing at about a 45, 50-degree angle right there. So this is bad. And the Northeast, which tends to lead, is almost at 600 copies of virus per milliliter of sewage. By the time you're up around 700-800, you're in a full-on surge. So we are almost there now. And if they keep climbing at this rate, which looks like it's being driven by a variant called EG5, which is a mutation of XBB192. All of the strains circulating now. Last year it was Omicron, BA1. That's what drove the big November-December spike in winter of 2021-2022. This year it's XBB, which the X means it's a cross transgenic strain. It means that somebody got infected with 2 strains at the same time, and the 2 strains swap genetic material within their body over the course of the infection, and then they spread it to somebody else. And it actually represented that recombination of genetic material of the virus, represented an improvement for the virus of its ability to infect people. So then XBB, like last December, started really spreading, and this year it is all of the strains that are really prevalent this year are some form of XBB, whether it's XBB.1.5, XBB.1.9, XBB.1.16. Anyway, so currently we've got this EG5 one, and that seems to be kicking a lot of ass. So for the last 6 weeks or 8 weeks, there's been a surge growing. If you've taken your mask off, put your mask back on. Avoid scenarios where you're likely to get infected, because there is a lot of COVID circulating currently. So we'll see what happens with the Midwest, because that is sort of a weird, it shot way up and then dropped off, but I don't know if that's just the data being incomplete or what. So anyway, COVID on the rise. COVID does not just kill, it disables. COVID infects the brain, including the brain stem, the heart, the liver, the gut. It attacks and kills your T cells, one of your major pillars of defense of your immune system. Very important. The kidneys, male reproductive system. Anywhere in your body that has ACE2 receptors, which is most of your major organs, COVID can get in via that receptor, and it can cause organ damage. The pancreas. People, especially children who get COVID, more likely to contract both type 1 and to develop type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So, yeah, kids who've been infected by COVID more likely to develop both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, which is really concerning because, while the overall outcome of those two types of diabetes are similar, the etiology, the origins of that are pretty different. But so, this virus gets into the body and infects directly a lot of the different organs, causes brain damage. That's what causes the brain fog and, quote, executive dysfunction, where people have a hard time not just remembering, although they do that too, but sort of organizing their thoughts, goal planning, and sort of thinking about things in order, delayed gratification so that you can actually follow through on plans. This is a really serious disease that doesn't just kill, it also disables. And anybody who's gotten long COVID, and I have, can tell you a lot of the symptoms can last a full year. Some of them never go away. So this is not something you want to mess around with. Also, the more you get reinfected, let's just put the number of reinfections thing up on the screen. And I've heard people try to downplay this, saying that, it came from a study from the VA. So what? It was a huge amount of people included in the study. Anyway, you've got here the number of infections of COVID per individual. You can see the number of serious, or the risk of serious health outcomes, negative health outcomes, hospitalization, kidney disease, cardiovascular disease, clotting disorders, pulmonary or lung problems, fatigue, gastrointestinal problems, diabetes, mental health problems, neurological problems, musculoskeletal problems. It goes up. Every time you get reinfected, your odds of getting some of these long COVID fallouts goes up. And there's another chart there. Let me bring up here. So people understand the risks of this thing. There's another that pretty much shows the same thing. The green is the first infection, and then the red is 2 infections, and then 3 or more infections is the purple. As you can see, it just goes up and up. The more you get infected, the more likely it is you're going to wind up with some major organ damage and some symptoms you really don't want. And this is usually my go-to. This is from April 2022, so we've known this for like a year and a half. Even mild COVID-19 can cause your brain to shrink, causing physical changes equivalent to a decade of aging and triggering problems with attention and memory. So causes actual brain mass loss, and then specific problems, especially in the memory centers. And like I said, it can infect the brainstem, which can interfere. The brainstem coordinates a lot of your involuntary or autonomic activity, like breathing and your heart beating and stuff like that runs on its own. And if you sort of infect the control box, so to speak, a lot of those automatic processes in your body that you don't have to consciously think about start getting dysregulated or disrupted. So you do not want this disease. Again, COVID on the rise, steadily rising for like 2 months now. So mask up In N95 we trust, and then make sure your vaccinations are up to date as a plan B. But plan A is don't get the thing in your body. Best way to avoid long COVID, the only really reliable way to avoid long COVID, vaccines may reduce your risk of long COVID, but they will not eliminate it, is don't get short COVID. All right. So let's get into the chat now. Now that we got that out of the way, I'm going to scroll back up to the top here. All right, found the top. Sometimes the comments like jump ahead and I lose comments, but that did not happen. So, hey, have you heard about the arrest of the Russian left thinker Bluesky? No, I have not. And I asked that person if they had any sort of follow-up thing on that, and I do not see any links. No, I haven't heard about that. Last thing I was reading about what's going on in Russia is there was a Politsturm article talking about how they just updated the conscription system in Russia. Previously, it was that if you weren't actually manually served a conscription notice, if you could just avoid it and not go into any of the drafting offices, then you weren't actually going to be drafted. Now they changed it where an electronic notice, whether you read it or not, means that you're drafted, and if you ignore it, it's serious consequences like you can't drive a car, and there's all kinds of other stuff. But no, I have not heard about Bluesky. If anybody wants to shed some light, then that would be appreciated. I took a class through the People's Forum on Pan-Africanism. It was very productive, and linking up with comrades around the world was very valuable in expanding my international connections and thinking. Absolutely. We must always, increase our internationalism, and especially being, if you're in the U.S., I mean, we're raised here with a very national chauvinist position. American exceptionalism, we're really taught to think that this country is the city on a hill, and explicitly taught that this country is like better than all other countries. And, there's a lot of other ways of doing things other than the specific ways that the U.S. does them. Even within capitalism, they're just different cultural systems that result in, really different ways of life. I feel like that book by Lenin is good at... What book are you talking about? We got a few books by Lenin on the channel, let me just put it that way. I feel like that book by Lenin is good at proving the point that the concept of multipolarity is very much anti-Leninist. The one you were talking about earlier in the chat. Especially near the end of section 5, monism and dualism. Yes, I think that was actually why I put it in the upcoming list. It's not that long of a work. So we're talking about a caricature of Marxism and imperialist economism. And yeah, I'll be doing that in coming months. But yeah, if people want to go ahead and read that. I agree. I think that was why I saw that, was somebody was citing that book as against the concept of multipolarity sort of being like this massive boon in and of itself. Yeah. Is there a way to do direct messages on Mastodon and Bluesky, since Musk is slowly killing Twitter? Yes, Mastodon does have direct messages. Bluesky does not yet. Bluesky, I think, has a lot of shortcomings. I really enjoy Bluesky just from... I think it's fun, and I find my funnier side coming out on Bluesky. Like, the attitude on there is very nonchalant. Like, it's not as aggro as Twitter, and it's also just not as serious as Twitter, which sometimes gets old. Like, at a certain point, I do kind of feel like scrolling through the thing like I'm in middle school again. But it is nice to take a break from like the ultra seriousness sometimes. However, they don't have direct messages, and just yesterday, so Musk announced that they're going to be eliminating the block feature on Twitter. Yeah, no. Actually, it's in the Google Play App Store thing. It's in the rules for the apps that get posted there that social media networks have to have the ability for users to block other users for safety. Otherwise, you can't even be listed. So, whether this was him talking out his ass, like completely, without looking through any of the consequences of this, I don't know if they're going to actually follow through on it. But after that got announced, there was a massive influx of people over to Bluesky, and the site started crashing immediately. So they've really got to get their shit together, because people are definitely looking for an alternative to Twitter right now. And I know there's Threads. I'm not on Threads. I'm not going to be on Threads. I don't do Meta at all. I don't do Facebook, Instagram, or Threads. I'm not going to be going over there. But yeah, Bluesky, if it wants to be serious, is it really got to get its shit together. It is a fun place to post, and a lot of the elite posters of Twitter did go over onto Bluesky and are doing fun stuff there. It's a good way to scroll through and kill 20 minutes sometimes. But yeah, anyway, no DMs yet there. So ECOWAS was talking about invasion to restore democracy. We're talking about Niger there. ECOWAS includes Senegal, but don't look up the recent politics of Senegal. Okay. I don't know the recent politics of Senegal. So the coup in Niger, the military junta, which is ruling now currently, and the president, I think, still is basically like hostage, or effectively hostage. Doesn't want to come out of the presidential housing, whatever it is, that building, but is like running out of supplies, I think. So I have been trying to do, I probably will do a video on that at some point. There's a lot to understand, though. Actually, my introduction to this was somebody who I didn't recognize popped into the comments, and they said, "People's Revolution in Niger. Cover it." First of all, fuck you. Second of all, People's Revolution. Really? So I went looking for any kind of platform or program of the junta that is now in control of Niger, and I could not find anything. Here's what I did find, and it's vague, and I can't actually share everything that I have read so far on this, because it's just, I'm still synthesizing information out of the articles that I've been pulling together. The overriding thing is I haven't been able to find anything in the way of a platform or program, and actually put out a call on social media and to the patrons and other things of like, hey, does anybody have specific information on what the junta in Niger is planning to do? Because, that would be one way to evaluate, is this a people's revolution? So far, it does not look that way to me at all. There are definitely some valid issues at play. Whether, though, this is just the military or that's the individuals within the military trying to capitalize on certain problems to elevate themselves into a higher position of power, that's not clear. I mean, I think that there's definitely things that skew in that direction in the analysis. There are groups within those who support the junta, such as M62, which do have a kind of populist, anti-colonialist bent, and do talk about some, issues we would recognize as sort of relevant and consistent in that. To the extent that these are sort of sincere, legitimate, and mass-backed is unclear. One of the things that I thought was a red flag in there was that they're anti-French, and then strongly, being anti-French is not the red flag. It's like, okay, you're anti-French, understandable, but then they're strongly pro-Russia, waving Russian flags, which I just thought was an odd, somewhat, raise an eyebrow, suspicious thing going on there. So the Wagner military group, actually I had a comment on this. Going to continue on this, I'm not just breaking off there. Comment was, so Wagner getting redeployed into this recent ECOWAS business, and ECOWAS, however you're pronouncing it, is Economic Community of West African States. So sort of like Northwest Africa, the part of Africa that bulges out to the west and the north. There's a bunch of countries in that general region that are part of this economic alliance. could be as strongly motivated by Putin and the Ministry of Defense wanting the Wagner private military company at arm's length, and preoccupied as it is motivated by Russia seeing anti-colonial struggles as possibly a developing front in its struggle with NATO, which truly would, help turn the current conflict into truly World War III as a competition between imperialists. But so let's break this down for a minute. What's been going on in this region for a while. So people sometimes go, hey, S4A, why do you still occasionally talk about 9/11? Why was that such an important thing? Well, there's a very good reason. The war on terror that the United States started with the 9/11 attacks, which in my opinion are clearly an inside job. None of the evidence, in my opinion, supports the government story at all. And I think that was exhaustively broken down by about 2006 for my taste and understanding. What did we get out of that? Well, out of the war on terror, we got a meta-war framework which allowed the U.S. pretty much carte blanche to do massive remilitarization of U.S. society, and many of U.S. allies also followed suit in that, to basically remilitarize and make major changes to both the U.S. foreign policy, making it much more aggressive and giving a justification for invading any country that they wanted to for any reason under the guise of, Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda is in there. Why do people sometimes call Al-Qaeda Al-Qaeda? Well, this goes back to the struggle in Afghanistan in the late 70s, around 1980, of was there going to be a Soviet-backed and Soviet-assisted revolution in Afghanistan, which is, despite being nearby to the USSR and also close to China, had not had a socialist revolution. And that's due to some of the particular conditions in Afghanistan, but the difficulty of actually having military incursions in Afghanistan is tremendous. Due to a lot of the geographic features, the mountains, the caves, all of that. Also, strong prevalence of very backward, religious fundamentalism and things like that. So you had the Mujahideen, who were reactionary fundamentalists fighting against any sort of progressive or revolutionary movement. Actually, I believe supported not just by the U.S., but also by China at one point. This was during the Dengist turn in the late 70s. But anyway, so you get the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden getting funded and aided by the U.S., and then that sort of continued with these fundamentalist groups becoming sort of assets of the U.S., but not necessarily in the most open way after that. The U.S. sort of funding a proxy conflict against the USSR in Afghanistan, and China also, I think, aiding in that as well. Then what happens to the Mujahideen and these extreme reactionary forces after that? Well, they show up in this narrative of what happened on 9/11, which, again, in my opinion, is complete bullshit. And you also see, subsequently, a complex process in which some of these forces start to spread into other countries outside of Afghanistan. And so we get, things, again, it gets complicated, but the Islamic State and different things. So at this time, like 2002, 2003, there really was not this kind of Islamic fundamentalist terrorism in any kind of organized way, or really at all, in this Northwest African region. Yet the U.S. started setting up shop there for, like, quote, counterterrorism efforts. And people were kind of like, what are you doing? There's not really terrorism here. And then eventually there was. So, again, going back to this idea of Al-Qaeda, that these Islamic fundamentalist groups are actually a sort of asset of the United States in supporting expansionist U.S. policy of like, oops, you got an outbreak of Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. Gee, we sure hate to see that. We can help you though. We can set up some military bases here, which conveniently will help our intelligence gathering efforts and other geopolitical dominance efforts. And so this started eventually growing in this area in Africa. So for a while recently, the French military forces were conducting a major operation 2014 to 2022 in this area. They did eventually pull out, and yet the terrorism is actually a problem at this point. But now there's sort of less assistance, I guess you could say. And some of these countries have been pivoting to requesting assistance from Russia and the Wagner PMC, which I believe that they're already in Mali. And there have been coups similar to what happened in Niger in a bunch of these countries. And it does seem to be connected somewhat with an anti-US, anti-French pivot, but not towards, socialism, towards Russia. So, is the inter-imperialist competition now extending into Africa, and is this another front opening up? Which, as the commenter, I think it was Nuka, was saying, Russia sees an opportunity here to gain dominance in a front against the struggle with NATO, but also the Wagner PMC just did this whole, march on Moscow thing, which kind of scared the shit out of some of the Russian bourgeoisie. Do they want to just get them the hell out of the general vicinity of Russia and send them down to Africa instead? It's a possibility. But yeah, as far as this being a people's revolution, I don't think so. It is true that Niger is one of the poorest countries, down, I think it's third from last in the UN Human Development Index. So it is objectively very poor. And about half of the children, I read by one estimate, in Niger do not have enough to eat. And so there are dire conditions there. I didn't really see anything about that being addressed by the junta, though. So they ousted the president, who there was a coup attempt before this current president was even inaugurated. I think it happened on Inauguration Day or just prior to Inauguration Day, and I think that was last year. And so there have been efforts against this president. So what has this president been doing that has been so horrible? I haven't really seen it. He was engaging in some development efforts, but he did not seem to be, and it does seem that some of the European countries and definitely ECOWAS have been supportive of, getting him back into power. Some of that might just be for stability's sake more than anything else. But I didn't see anything that this guy was doing that was especially egregious. Again, it's an area of the world that has been underdeveloped for a very long time, and you could argue has not been getting better. So, I mean, as far as what's going wrong, well, they're not getting out of that position nearly quickly enough, although all of the reasons why is a much more complicated conversation. As far as what the specific grievances are against this president, I could not really find them. Again, there is the issue of terrorism, that maybe he wasn't doing enough on that, but he was doing some things. So that, to me, while there needs to be more research into that, I didn't see that as at least at this point, clearly compelling reason or motivation. Nor, even if that was the case, would that necessarily in itself constitute a people's revolution. You need a lot more to constitute a people's revolution than that. Let alone, sort of workers' revolution beyond that, if we're talking about a socialist perspective. Trying to think of what else is coming up. So they've been in this standoff for a while where a lot of the other countries, there's a couple of countries that are not demanding that the junta putschists step down, but a lot of other countries are, with a handful of exceptions. So that's, a lot of the situation that I've seen so far. And like I said, there are people who support the putsch who have stated that they have some kind of, anti-colonial agenda. Whether this means just trading Russia for France, though, I don't know how that's going to work out in the end. And I don't know how much of that is simple naivete and how much of it is, is this actually sort of more directly backed by Russia? I really don't know. But anyway, food for thought. Let's get back into the comments. I'll bet that there are some other comments there. I'll come back up, but I want to see the more current comments right now, if anybody has anything on that. Sorry about lack of info on Niger Coup platform. Almost no info on it in the English-speaking world. Yeah, I mean, I didn't see it kind of anywhere, English-speaking or not. But all right, let's continue now. Maybe people will post some other things. Would I recommend communist tattoos? Not really. I mean, that's a very personal decision, but I'm not gonna weigh in on that. I'm heavily interested in the AI stuff. All right, maybe we'll read it. If we read that today, I'll probably make it the very last thing, like after we've run out of everything else. Have I looked into Paul Cockshot's videos refuting unequal exchange, saying that the third world is not as productive as the first world? I stopped listening to Paul Cockshot after he stopped saying that there was no oppression of LGBTQ plus people. I mean, just fuck off. I stopped listening to that guy after that. He was putting out some very pointedly, I thought, bigoted anti-LGBTQ videos. And no, I had no use really for him after that point. This was like just going in a very wrong direction, and I don't know. This was a while ago. I can't even like resummon my thoughts to summarize them for you right now, unfortunately. But no, I have not seen that. That guy says some weird shit though. That's about the best I can say. The intercontinental tensions in Africa are rising. Okay, I mean, it's a bit vague, but you know. Police are the legal profession of evil bastards and Irish unionists. Yeah, so that podcast I mentioned, it's called Thin Blue Lies. If you go to the Red Army, READ Army YouTube channel, it's linked off of the S4A channels tab, if you go to the channels tab at the YouTube channel. It's also on Spotify and other podcast channels. Lots of cop gangs instigate new pigs in prison because that's the first place new pigs have to do their work. LAPD gangs is something everyone should Google and research. Yes. New updates on protracted people's war in the Philippines. There from redherald.org. Thank you. I'll check that link out. I did see something recently. Actually, let me bring up the article now that that came up. People are saying that, and again, I haven't had time to. This is from The Guardian. I haven't had time to evaluate this yet, but there was an article that came up, I saw, that the China-Philippines conflict could escalate. Okay, China-Philippines dispute could escalate into superpower conflict, say analysts. This is by Helen Davidson in Taipei. This is from August 8. Expert warns of, quote, significant escalatory potential. Oh, jumped ahead. After Chinese Coast Guards used a water cannon on a Philippine boat. So, reading some of this article. A territorial dispute between China and the U.S.-aligned Philippines is at increasingly high risk of escalating into a conflict involving the two superpowers, analysts have said, after Chinese Coast Guards used a water cannon on a Philippine boat. Global concern trolling here, about China's naval activities is growing as the country expands and modernizes its military and shows increasing aggression in its claims over the South China Sea and Taiwan. Joint drills with Russia, during which a flotilla sailed near Alaska this weekend, have also heightened concern over military coordination between Beijing and Moscow. On Saturday, China's Coast Guard directed a water cannon at a Philippine Coast Guard resupply vessel en route to the second Thomas Shoal in the Spratly Islands, which Beijing also claims. Philippine military personnel are living on board a grounded former warship, the Sierra Madre, deliberately scuttled at the shoal in 1999 to reinforce Manila's claims. China's Coast Guard also used a water cannon against a Philippine supply crew in November 2021. The Philippine Coast Guard has accused the Chinese crew of illegal conduct and dangerous maneuvers, and its government has summoned the Chinese ambassador to lodge a diplomatic protest. Its foreign ministry said it was unable to reach Beijing counterparts during the incident. The US, EU, France, Japan, and Australia were among nations to voice support for the Philippines and concern over China's actions. Wow, how surprising. Washington also reaffirmed its commitment to obligations under a mutual defense treaty to defend the Philippines if its public vessels and forces come under armed attack. Blake Hertzinger, a research fellow at the University of Sydney's United States Studies Center, said there was, quote, significant escalatory potential in the Philippine holdings of the South China Sea. Beijing's risky behavior in the region has the potential to draw the two powers into conflict, even without intending to do so, Hertzinger said. What activity would trigger the treaty and how close the weekend's incident came remains unclear, said Alessio Padolano, professor of war and strategy in East Asia at King's College London. Both sides have released footage of the confrontation. The Philippine Coast Guard spokesman, Jay Tariella, also released photos purporting to show boats from China's maritime militia assisting the interception of the Philippine supply mission. But Padolano said that the U.S. was sending Beijing a message that it considered activity in disputed areas such as the shoal as covered by the treaty. Quote, if these things continue to escalate, there will be a serious conversation with the U.S. and Philippines on how to cooperate so that the Philippines remain firmly in control of the situation as much as possible. So, yeah. Beijing says its Coast Guard was, quote, professional and restrained in having lawfully stopped two Philippine vessels which it accused of violating Chinese sovereignty. Under the administration of its president, Bongbong Marcos, who succeeded Rodrigo Duterte in June 2022, the Philippines has strengthened its ties and increased cooperation with the U.S., particularly in pushing back on China's territorial claims. So anyway, this article actually goes on for quite a while. You know what, it's not that long. Amanda Xiao, senior China analyst with the Crisis Group, said that Beijing had traditionally sought to draw a line between Philippine transportations of humanitarian supplies and of construction equipment to the shoal. Statements suggested it was blaming the latter on the statements suggested it was blaming this incident on the Philippines for transporting the latter. This is unlikely to be the primary motivation, she said on Twitter. The use of a more forceful, though not new, tactic is likely more tied to Beijing's concerns with the Marcos administration's U.S. tilt and more forward-leaning South China Sea policy than the specifics of the resupply. China's claim of sovereignty over about 90% of the South China Sea was found by The Hague in 2016 to have no legal basis, but Beijing continues to ignore that ruling and has boosted its presence in the region, in particular through its Coast Guard. Quote, China has created a Coast Guard with a mission to expand Chinese control in the South China Sea. This is all based on a warped historical narrative. It's so hard to read. It's like so incredibly skewed. Did they interview any sort of Chinese officials on this at any point? Anyway, it's just sort of hard to read for the slant in it. At the same time that China's Coast Guard was challenging Philippine vessels in the South China Sea, its Navy was conducting joint drills with Russia off the coast of Alaska. The exercise raised some concern about the growing cooperation between Beijing and Moscow, whose leaders declared a limitless partnership in 2021. And then, of course, back in March of this year, Xi and Putin had a summit where basically it was said that Chinese capital was going to move into Russia to replace all the Western capital that had moved out. So I guess China finally won their decades-long conflict with the USSR and are taking it over for profit. But anyway, but did not draw the same opprobrious reaction from the U.S. as the Philippine incident. Available information suggests that the 11 Chinese and Russian warships were in the U.S.'s exclusive economic zone, where the U.S. Convention on the Law of the Seas, UNCLOS, says that foreign military activity is legal as long as it doesn't intrude into territorial waters. The U.S. deployed 4 U.S. Navy destroyers to the area, but government and military statements did not suggest that the presence was a threat. Alaska Senators Lisa Murkowski and Dan Sullivan, however, described the activity as a, quote, incursion and called for increased military funding for their region. Quote, reacting by calling this a threat or an incursion is playing into Beijing's hands in particular, as it commonly labels legal U.S. maritime activity in the same way when objecting to it, said Hertzinger from the Sydney-based United States Studies Center. The U.S. government frequently conducts freedom of navigation exercises, including in places like the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea, to reassert their rights under UNCLOS. However, Hertzinger added, and this is the end, the U.S. has long been the only power capable of projecting significant combat power far from its shores without much fear of similar operations being conducted near its own homeland. These kinds of operations are intended to shake the foundation of that long-held assumption of relative insulation. So he's saying that's what China's trying to do, is just like, oh, the U.S. can go anywhere, well, we can go anywhere too, and there's not necessarily anything major in that. So I know the thing about, that there is a Maoist ongoing insurrection in the Philippines, which China has failed to really support in any way, and more than that, they've actually sold weapons to the Philippine government. Here you see, some sort of superficial conflict with the Philippine government, which, they're saying could draw the U.S. into sort of more direct confrontation. In any case, China seems to be mostly interested in making deals, making money, and does not seem to be interested in like major war at this point. So, although that is, the U.S.'s MO. But anyway, thank you. I will check out that article later. My partner is starting to ask combative questions now about communism. She is nominally left, but I view this whole picking at communist theory as like a preliminary homework to becoming a communist. Like, how many of us here in the chat had questions and concerns about socialism even after seeing how bad capitalism is and was? So it seems bad, but it's actually good news. Yeah, I would say that that's probably true. I mean, one thing that comes to mind is the Marxism versus Liberalism, the Stalin H.G. Wells interview. I find that just so relatable. Anybody who's been in the left and had these discussions on social media, it's just so relatable. Like, you've seen that exact conversation, at least various points within it, between Stalin and Wells, so many times. So I don't know, it might be something. I don't know what she has seen so far, but if the small local struggle does not unite with a large struggle, but claims to be its final stage, it will become adventurous and is easily crushed. Yes. The framing socialism or extinction really puts a fire on the butt for the lazy. I mean, it's true. Yeah, we're not just talking even about economic collapse, like a collapse of living standards for people. Like, if industry breaks down, we won't have mass-produced clothing and food and things like that. Transportation, communication, all the, kind of things that we take for granted, and that modern life is based around, and that we've all been trained to meet our needs by using. That would be bad enough, but we're also looking at a situation where the collapse of capitalism extends beyond just the economic industrial realm into the ecological, and causing massive natural disasters, already causing mass extinction. So yeah, and socialism or extinction, or the idea that socialism is inevitable, rather, does not mean socialism is definitely going to happen. It means that if there is a future for humanity, it's in socialism. That's what it being inevitable means. Capitalism has gone as far as it can go, and we see multiple overlapping crises now of climate, of COVID, mass extinction, you name it. If capitalism could solve these problems, that would be good for capitalism. It would do that. If capitalism could solve these problems, it would mean that it could stabilize itself, and it could just say, look, capitalism's here to stay. It can't solve these problems. So if you want a solution to climate change, which is absolutely, it's not even climate change anymore. It's climate emergency, it's climate crisis, climate catastrophe. As we speak right now, there's Hurricane Hillary moving up the Baja Peninsula, very rare hurricane on the west coast of North America. So, a lot of unusual things happening and very disturbing. And again, mass extinction going on. In some areas, like 95% of species no longer exist. The biodiversity dropping. So anyway, we've covered that in past streams. But yeah, if there's going to be a future for humanity, it's under socialism. Capitalism cannot solve these problems. If you want to see them solved, you must become a socialist. It's that simple. Because nothing else is going to end capitalism. Capitalism could end in just catastrophe and, basically the end of the human species. It could do that if we're to extend any of this. If there's anything to be saved about humanity, it has to be done under socialism. So, I also struggle sometimes to explain to some people today about socialism because they want to compare it with historical material conditions. Yeah, and especially historical material conditions, not just at a different place in time, but in a completely different country that has a completely different history. So, how many countries today are industrially on the same level as Tsarist Russia or post-war China? Other than some countries in West Africa, there are no countries with the same material conditions. People will work hard if they're educated on the alternatives. Workers will be more productive when they have their bare human rights met. I think this is going back to that comment about labor discipline and like people's objections to that. Of all the objections I've heard to that, that it sounds like anarchism is like literally the opposite. So the comment kind of took me off guard. How do I like Mao's writing? Oh, because I was talking about writing styles. Well, it's hard with Mao because there is such a leap, I think, from Chinese to English. But I don't know how I would characterize Mao's writing, actually. I like it. I don't know that it has a strong character. And in that case, it may have more to do with the translator. But I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure how I would characterize it. I do like it. I like doing the Mao readings, but... Reforms out of a fear of revolution will and have doomed us. Reforms to show the limits of what we can get while the capitalists are in power are worthwhile. Yeah, I mean, those struggles build class consciousness and also, again, raise awareness that the real things we need are on the other side. Are on the other side of the wall between capitalism and socialism. I just want to explain, this is, I think, to the partner maybe that we're talking about before, that we must devote much of human activity towards undoing the harmful effects of capitalism on human health, ecosystems, and biodiversity. So people are going to have to get on board with that and see the necessity, which they will of their own volition. I mean, the idea that people don't need to at least be engaged in some discussion of this now, I think is completely wrong-headed. How many people in the U.S., for example, are openly hostile to like any idea about environmentalism or anything? I mean, it's significant, I think. So plenty aren't, but this is a discussion we actually would need to have. So anyway, right now we have a shortage of teachers and healthcare workers, not because people are lazy, but because capitalists don't care about human beings. Yeah, I mean, there's a deliberate shortage of all of these things. There's been a nursing shortage in the United States for decades now. They just don't seem to care. This is partly, there is I think within healthcare professions in particular, there is an effort to over-regulate for the specific purpose of gatekeeping so as to artificially create scarcity and keep fees high. So, there are other models of community-centered healthcare where people with less formal training are pulled into healthcare provision roles, and it actually works fine. That's used in some parts of India and other things. So it's like, yeah, this whole idea, the I said over-regulation, the over-professionalization of healthcare is something of an issue where, you know, you do need highly trained professionals, but all of the care does not need to necessarily be directly administered by them. They can also be used in more of an overseer role for bringing in people from the community where professionals are scarce because, you know, being a high paid healthcare professional tends to appeal to people who, you know, they want to take that money and spend it. So they tend to be more attracted to like urban places, places where there, you know, is more luxury to be found, places to spend that money. Out in the more rural regions, there's, you know, you're making a lot of money, there's less maybe desire to live out there. And so you have fewer professionals, and then the healthcare just doesn't get performed in a lot of cases. So there's like maybe other ways to use healthcare professionals rather than in direct provision of care, but creating more of a community model. Anyway, there's a lot of different ways to fix the situations that we have now. But I mean, also in the case of the United States, we could easily train a lot more people, but there's so many barriers in the cost of education and so many other things. But all right. Capitalism has made scarcity more real than necessary. Yeah, I mean, they do artificial scarcity. Because of climate emergency, it's an emergency, so undoing scarcity will be a major task for a newly empowered revolutionary class. Looking forward to the homeless industrial complex writings. I'm still in the very early stages of organizing in the shelter I'm in. I will try to get that long one out next week. It's held up the entire playlist, and that's happened with the basic Marxism-Leninism playlist as well. I just don't like not posting stuff for like a week and a half, but yeah. Anyway. I'm on this NoVID road trip. This is a no-COVID road trip from Texas to Washington. It's been weird. The ferry boat line was filled with coughers of all ages, 2 very sick children in particular. Windows up, not testing. Yeah, windows up and close your little vent thing on your, air system in your car. Not testing wastewater in Seattle. On an island now with my fox-pilled and alcohol-pickled dad stressing. Yikes. It sounds like a bad time. I can't stress enough how many people were on that ferry. Yeah, this is why we're having a major outbreak. And have you heard a peep from the U.S. government about it? I haven't. So anyway. Recently, numbers have started climbing here in Austria again, too. Good evening. Yeah, I mean, we are already in the U.S. So here, let me put the BioBot thing back up for a second. We're already in the U.S. Kind of at November numbers, and we're in August. So here's the whole thing. Overall, I would say that this year is most closely following the pattern of 2021. If you look over where it says January 2021 on the left side of the screen, you have a big surge in late fall and early winter. Then it drops off, and there's kind of a lull. Then it drops even a little bit lower. Then it goes up in the fall, late July and August, exactly like is happening this year. That's when we had Delta. That's that little mini mountain there. Then Delta sort of went into a lull briefly in late October, early November, and then late November, early December, Omicron BA1 kicked in, and that's where you get that massive peak there. Then that dropped way down, and then in the spring of last year, April 2022, you get this double, twin peaks, if you will, double peaked, long outbreak. Basically, the average COVID level from April to January last year was higher than the average surge in 2020 or 2021. So we just had like one sustained surge with a couple of peaks within it. And then there was a lull in late winter and spring and early summer this year. And then, but even that lull was much higher than the previous lulls, either the post-BA1 lull or the pre-Delta lull or the 2022 lull, much higher lull. and that now it's coming back. So we're on an overall timeline this year that's similar to the 2021 timeline. I don't know if we're going to get some kind of massive new mega strain like Omicron, but right now we're in sort of the 2023 equivalent of the Delta spike. I don't know what's going to come after that, obviously, but COVID is by no means over, and I don't know what it's going to take for people to get that, or for the government to actually talk about it honestly. But it's not being talked about honestly. It's being covered up. Planning on getting my 4th vaccine next week. Yeah, I mean, stay up to date on your vaccinations, because that is Plan B. Unfortunately, like, the vaccines just are not as strong as people I think are used to. People are used to thinking, oh, I got vaccinated against whatever disease, therefore I don't have to worry about it. Or at most, like with tetanus, you got to update it every 10 years or whatever. But with COVID, it's just the vaccines, they provide reduced risk of various outcomes and hospitalization and death. So, I mean, you're in better shape than if you didn't get the vaccine, for sure. There's also lower odds of getting long COVID. But these odds aren't zero. And it doesn't actually prevent you from completely getting sick. It is likely to make you much less sick than if you didn't have the vaccine. So it's good. It's a plan B, but it's not a sort of catch-all. And I think people have been led to believe that, and it's very deeply misleading. The efficacy is high, or at least especially the efficacy of the vaccines was very high when they were first rolled out. There's an unfortunate thing, though, called immune imprinting, where your immune system can learn the first thing of a type that it's exposed to and kind of latch onto that, and then it can have great difficulty adjusting to new variations of that thing. It's just imprinted on the first thing, and then it tries to treat subsequent things which look like that but are different as that first thing, and it's not always as successful. That's been a running issue with COVID, and we've seen the vaccine efficacy drop as time has gone on and new strains have emerged, because the body's immune system, though primed over and improved over somebody that didn't get the vaccine, there's just limits to how your immune system functions and how it imprints on the earlier strain, and this has resulted in the overall efficacy dropping. So it's more important than ever. Yes, do stay up to date on the vaccines, but mask, mask, mask. That's plan A. And you get the vaccine in case of a mask failure, but do not contribute to a mask failure by not wearing one, because that's your only real kind of surefire thing. So, no, COVID is not endemic in any way. Somebody's saying maybe it's endemic in the sense that everyone gets it over the holidays and then again in the summer every damn year. No, it's a pandemic. So, endemic means a disease that is confined to very predictable levels in a contained geographic area. And COVID is not that. It's uncontrolled global spread that continues to mutate and continues to have surges. That's completely different from endemic. Endemic means like a predictable, stable level that's also confined to one geographic region. So this is not that. This is a pandemic, uncontrolled global spread that continues to mutate. People do seem to get, like, there does seem to be periods of lulls generally that follow big surges. But look at last year again. We had like a sustained surge the entire year because new strong variants kept emerging. So, and this is across the whole world too. So no, it's not endemic at all. And even things that are endemic, malaria is endemic in some places. That doesn't mean it's not dangerous. So even if it was endemic, you could still need to avoid it, quote, like the plague. Even endemic diseases can be very serious and produce very serious negative health outcomes. But it's also not endemic. So yeah, there's that too.